Less than 23% of age-eligible Americans are even qualified to serve in the military services. Less than 1% of Americans even feel inclined to do so. But less than 1% of those who do decide to raise that right hand and say, "I'll do it," are even qualified to become a part of that life we see in the movies as a part of special operations. Hello, my name is Major Mike Webb, a retired soldier from the elite 75th Ranger Regiment. While serving on active duty, I had begun my career in special operations with a rapid deployment force protection capability, popularly known as the 75th Ranger Regiment, before moving on to an assignment in strategic counterintelligence. Some may recall back in 2018 when the nation of Israel, after over a decade, had officially acknowledged its role in what has become known as Operation Orchard, a military strike force that was deployed against a target in Syria in September 2007, which had claimed to be attempting to enhance its energy capabilities and that had erected what appeared to be a gas-cooled graphite moderated reactor that was capable of producing weapons-grade plutonium. This was the second application of the Begin Doctrine, named for former Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who had ordered the bombing of Iraq's nascent nuclear reactor in 1981, and which calls on the Jewish state to destroy any enemy country's nuclear capabilities. With reports of surging infections of COVID-19, our invisible enemy for the past few years, shortly followed by the approval of the new vaccines for an expected surge of infections in the fall and winter, it may be a good time to reflect on how this public health crisis had begun, a topic that has been surrounded by controversy and division, with most split between just two likely scenarios: a natural spillover from an animal host to a human, or a possibility that the virus has escaped from a lab. Focusing upon the latter scenario, at least after the first year of the pandemic declaration, Secretary of State Antony Blinken had adopted the posture that presumably China shares our mutual interest in determining the truth, especially if it purports to be a responsible international actor, to do everything it can to provide all the information it has to make sure we can hopefully prevent this from happening again. However, at that time, he had conceded that China still hadn't given us the transparency we need, access for international inspectors and experts for real-time information sharing. And so, applying my experience at the planning level for strike force type operations for the next few minutes, let's examine some of the considerations that might be of significance for military planners for these types of operations on the order of the early morning raid of the Abbottabad security compound in the early morning hours that had ended the fugitive run of the planner of the terror attacks on 9/11, about a decade after the terrorist attacks on New York and Washington. In the Abbottabad raid, although we knew the identity of the target, Osama bin Laden, even former CIA Deputy Director Mike Morrell has conceded that there had only been about a 50 to 60% chance that this known terrorist was even at that location. However, a raid on Wuhan, or even a military strike, would generally require a little more homework, especially considering the nature of the target, which a military strike might further complicate should these potential biological agents escape, or others that may be at that location, resulting in collateral damage, unacceptable losses, or so one might reasonably expect. But it is further complicated by the fact that China has not only the facility in Wuhan, but also a similar facility 1,000 miles away west in Yunnan, which also happens to be the same location of what has been determined to have been the original source for the virus, a horseshoe bat that almost exclusively is found only in that region in China, but which somehow had, according to the accepted scenarios, commenced a chain reaction of multiple spillover events between species culminating in the eruption of the outbreak in December 2019 that became the COVID-19 pandemic. However, taking the more hawkish posture, as had been adopted in Operation Orchard, pursuing the Bacon Doctrine, one possible course of action to eliminate a clear and present danger arising from what had potential for a biological weapon capability would be to conduct a strike not just against the research laboratory in Wuhan, but also pursuing the same objectives, the capability 1,000 miles away west in Utah. And whenever we go into military operations, we always start to think not only about collateral damage, but also about fratricide. Some may recall the scene from the Gulf War in the film Courage Under Fire, and the actor Denzel Washington had portrayed the character Army Lieutenant Colonel Nate Sterling, conducting a movement to contact of M1 Abrams tanks that had been infiltrated by Iraqi T-72s, resulting in his order that led to fratricide, an order to target, engage, and destroy what had turned out to be one of his fellow tank commanders, but which had prompted his command decision to his soldiers for recovery, ordering them to turn on their lights, knowledgeable that the adversary tank and armor assets could be readily detected in the night and acquired as targets because those forces were not equipped with a similar illumination capability, distinguishing them readily from friendly forces. And as the president had said on the first anniversary of the pandemic declaration, finding the light in the darkness is probably one of the most American things that we do. And in the Army, we do more before 9 in the morning than most people do all day. It's not just a job, it's an adventure. Moreover, especially considering the potential for risks to soldiers' lives, a great consideration during the infections aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt, often termed for military planners as force protection considerations, all recall some embarrassment in the press arising from deploying a military force to Iraq, only to discover what should have been discovered during proper military planning and intelligence preparation of the battlefield: no weapons of mass destruction, or no WMD, which, incidentally, as a term, does not generally include biological agents for military planners, for it is a capability as old as the Assyrians in the 4th century BC, and perhaps going even further back, the days of Moses, which had been both historically and doctrinally deployed not as weapons of mass destruction, but rather as weapons of terror, a distinction with a difference. And as Karl von Clausewitz had observed, all war is simply an extension of policy, but conducted by other means. By other means. By other means, and war is a business. Bloody business. But a business nonetheless. And even in 1984, when the nation of China had finally, over a decade after President Nixon's historic visit to China, during which he had negotiated for that nation to join the other civilized nations of the world in signing on to the United Nations Biological Weapons Convention, emissaries from Beijing depositing what are known to diplomats as accession documents at locations in New York, the headquarters of the United Nations, as well as in Moscow and Washington, had attached a rather thought-raising note. Just like Secretary of State Blinken's appeal to China, invoking our mutual interest in discovering the truth, generally as responsible international actors, the Chinese diplomats in 1984 had provided assurances that the basic spirit of the Convention on the Prohibition of Biological Weapons conforms to China's consistent position and is conducive to the efforts of the world's peace-loving countries and peoples in fighting against aggression and maintaining world peace, and had most emphatically emphasized, invoking some feelings, that China once was one of the victims of biological, bacteriological weapons itself. However, that had been presented with a thought-provoking caveat, and in diplomatic communications there is always a place for a but clause to provide wiggle room and sufficient ambiguity to protect present and future national interests. According to the diplomatic emissaries at that time, China had added, in the spirit of international cooperation, of course, as the Chinese government considers that the convention has its defects, stating as particular example that it fails to provide in explicit terms for the prohibition of the use of biological weapons and the concrete and effective measures for supervision and verification, and it lacks forceful measures of sanctions in the procedure of complaint against instances of violations of the conventions. In layman's terms, no enforcement provisions. Just signing on to the general idea of being against the proliferation of biological weapons. And these diplomats were communicating to others that they were not so naive as to believe that that diplomatic gesture was a perfect solution to this problem, and that especially after 10 years of negotiations and careful deliberations, they were not committing to anything blindly that might at some point create a liability for them, placing them in a disadvantaged position vis-a-vis other civilized nations of the world. And in that same spirit of international cooperation, the diplomatic emissaries had expressed that, however, it is the hope of the Chinese government that these defects may be made up or corrected at an appropriate time, sometime in the future, and we shall overcome someday. And so it should not come as a surprise, even decades after their joining the Biological Weapons Accords, according to the State Department, lacking the evolutionary pressure of enforcement provisions. Historically, the issue of compliance by China with the BWC has been of concern for many years, though the assessments have changed over time. Nor that as late as 2005, the United States assessed that China maintains some elements of an offensive biological weapons capability in violation of its Biological Weapons Convention obligation. Nor should it come as a great surprise that in 2010 it was noted that China possessed an offensive biological weapons program prior to its accession to the BWC in 1984, and was obligated at that time to eliminate that program upon acceding to the convention, but which had never been done, concluding that the United States continues to know that the BWC CBM declarations China had submitted have neither documented that offensive program nor documented that China has eliminated the program or any remaining biological weapons in accordance with Article 2 of the BWC. And as late as January 2019, the directors of the agencies and the intelligence community had presented to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence that the nation of China had continued to remain perhaps the largest threat in the world regarding a biological weapons capability. And as late as August 2019, according to the State Department, there had been no confirmation that China had destroyed yet the biological weapons that it had possessed in 1984, when it had signed on to the Biological Weapons Accords. And if it has been confirmed that China maintains a biological weapons program, which historically and doctrinally has not been characterized as weapons of mass destruction, but rather as weapons of mass terror, killing one to scare 1,000 according to even Maoist doctrine, one would reasonably expect that if it has only 2 biological research laboratories, the most popularly known institute located in Wuhan, from where some have expressed concern that a virus attributed to more fatalities worldwide than Adolf Hitler during the Holocaust had escaped, that force protection capability would more likely than not be located there, as well as at its other facilities in Yunnan, providing sufficient incentive for the Chinese to inform others that they did not want a robust investigation of persons going inside their laboratory facilities to see exactly what they were doing. And it is unlikely also that when as late as March 2015, when research scientists like Jen Shi and Ralph Barrett have been collaborating on research involving recombinant coronaviruses at UNC Chapel Hill when they had reported the successful cultivation of a source-like coronavirus both in vivo, on a living host, but also in vitro, or in a petri dish, that they were wholly unaware of the diplomatic and military history connected to this very topic, involving that which is described appropriately as dual-use research of concern and on what has been our invisible enemy, during what has also been the longest respiratory tract infection pandemic in recorded history. But at least for military planners, there is an age-old maxim. Sometimes the enemy of my enemy is my friend, because even in international politics, there are no permanent enemies and no permanent friends, just permanent interests. And for those without a need to know, there may be a good reason why we, plural of I, may never know the nature of the possible origins of this virus, even if a failure to comprehensively investigate the zoonotic origin through collaborative and carefully coordinated studies would leave the world vulnerable to future pandemics arising from the very same human activities that have repeatedly put us on a collision course with these novel viruses. Because simply this virus isn't stupid and has fooled us, plural of I, before. This briefing is unclassified. This message was approved by Major Mike Webb. Honest. This has been a Filmways presentation, darling.
And y'all come back now. Yeah.